Hi, Misha here, and this is kind of an impromptu little series looking at the heritage of the M3 knife's, well, blade. Yeah, the 6 3/4 inch blade with a knife, not quite a foot long. And last time we talked about the M4 bayonet. This is a late kind of first run, made in '53. And then we have a very standard second run made from '54 all the way through '72 in the US and outside even more. And these were adaptations of it for the M1 Carbine. And today we're going to talk about how it was adapted for the M1 Garand, the M5. But we're not going to stop there. We're going to kind of go through because we're getting to the point now where things are interconnected. It's almost like this is the M3's extended cinematic stabby universe. So before we dive in, as always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support us, check out Patreon. With that, let's dive in and pull out. Back before this was even made in '53 by Camillus, 51, Springfield was not just redesigning for a new crossguard the M4 bayonet. They were already considering, what about the M1 Garand? Reports from in the field in Korea, where the Garand standard issue, were saying that the latch on the current bayonet just wasn't working out well for them with gloves, and it was also kind of long and heavy. The M1 Garand started off using the M1905 bayonet, the same as the 1903 Springfield, and then in World War II that was shortened to what became known as the M1 bayonet. So went from a 16-inch blade to a 10-inch blade, in a muzzle ring and all that good stuff. But yeah, they wanted to do something little different, little better. At Springfield, they worked on what they called the T10 prototype in 1952. And it would be the first to kind of get away from the muzzle ring to the lock stud to go in the gas plug of the Garand. In fact, I believe this, even today, is the only U.S. bayonet without a ring on it. Now, the work was begun at Springfield, but it was actually finished up at Imperial in 1952-53. So the modified T10 became the M5 here. One screw is missing, sorry. And after testing and trials, it was officially adopted in May of 1953 as the M5 bayonet for the M1 Garand. And same basic blade as we've seen before. However, at construction, most of the components here are actually stampings. Stamped steel, sheet steel, that kind of thing. Simplifying production, making things more consistent. Now there's no latch on the butt of this, like on the M4. Rather, we have this catch here, which interacts back here for that type of lug. Different style. This was thought to be easier to use with gloves. And again, just cheaper to make. And of course, we're going from a 10-inch blade down to under 7, so it's lighter. And these would be among the first to use the synthetic grips. The T10 used a slightly different style of grip. This style was kind of started off by Imperial. Very closely mirrors what would appear on the second run of M4s here. These were adopted shortly before the end of the Korean War and ordered into production. Although in the beginning it was a little haphazard. Obviously, because Imperial had helped finish this out, they received one of the early contracts. In the summer of '53, they had actually been given a contract to make more M1 bayonets for the M1. But by August of that year, that was switched over, the contract, to the M5 because it was, newly adopted. So they would be one of the first makers of this pattern. Another early maker was Utica. Also in '53, they had been given a contract to make around 80,000 new M1 bayonets. And they did fulfill that contract. But evidence has shown some Utica stamped M5s showing up, probably made in late 53, early 54, after this run of M1 bayonets. No one knows how many were turned out by Utica, but it was a small number, 20, maybe 30,000, all made early on, and that seems to be it. In fact, at this point in time, Utica kind of falls away as a supplier of bayonets to the U.S. government and goes about their business doing other things, so they're out of the game. But we do have Ariel. In the spring of 1954, they get a contract to make 75,000, I believe, 80,000 M5 bayonets, and nothing at all happened. There was no controversy. No, the actual first company contracted from the get-go, no changes, to make the M5. They actually tried to pull the contract very shortly thereafter, but congressional representatives, back at a time when they actually looked out for their constituents in that district and everything, it called them on it, and the U.S. Army kind of rescinded the rescension, and so Ariel was able to fulfill their M5 contract. After all the hullabaloo of the Ariel contract in the early summer of 1954, things weren't going good. Early field reports, there were complaints about this bayonet, and in fact, in October, some high-up generals in the Army actually requested to suspend production and, reevaluate, but it was denied. In fact, that December, another contract would be let out for 57,500 new M5s to a company we haven't discussed yet, J&D Tool. And presumably this contract went okay, relatively small, because in 56, J&D would get another contract to make them, and this would actually end up being the final M5 contract. Is that because the M5 was canceled? No. That's because we ended up with the M5A1. Did this address some of the complaints in the field? No. The M5A1 exists because this exists. The M6 bayonet for the M14. Interesting kind of relationship here. All the way back when the M5 was being developed, they considered that the pattern they were going to for the Garand could be translated over to the new rifle, which is undergoing trials, the .30 light rifle. And so by 1954, Springfield has the T12 prototype for the T44, which would become the M14. And it's returned to the muzzle ring. It has a latch similar to the M5, with one difference. This is what they call a floating latch. That means the little socket in here where the spring's at is actually cut out as an oval so that the bayonet can recoil slightly, just like 1/10 of an inch, as the gun fires. This was actually directly inspired by the FN-FAL, the T-48, which was being tested in 54 alongside it. We actually talked about it in the Israeli FAL video, how that works. The idea was when you take a bayonet on and off a gun, having it on, having it off, changes the point of impact. Well, if your bayonet can oscillate with the barrel, will this keep the point of impact consistent depending on if the bayonet is there or not? In the 50s, the idea was, yeah, let's do that. So what they essentially did is they liked that feature from the T-48's bayonet, and they ordered Springfield to carry it over. Not only was the floating catch translated to the upcoming M6 bayonet, we'll float back to it in a bit when it was adopted in 57, but it was carried to the M5, becoming the M5A1 experimental test trials, whatever you like to call it, bayonet. Created at Springfield and tested at Aberdeen. But there were concerns. Whereas the M6 used a muzzle ring, this used this plug that went into the gas cylinder. They were worried that on the recoil out, that would not properly reseat and bind everything up. So they actually extended out testing and trials and even kind of rejiggered the plug a bit to try to keep it all consistent returning. So it wasn't actually formally adopted until April of 1956 as the M5A1. They did not do this really for point of impact reasons. They did it so that the same latch and internals could be used for the M5 and the upcoming M6. So it was a production deal more than anything else. I should also point out that the latch styling here is more stamped in folded steel and a more modern styling versus the original M5. This also is more recessed, and this sticks out a bit more. I don't know if that was incidental. That might be the one thing they did to try to address some of the complaints from the field about removing it, is having a latch that sticks out further and a little larger. So there might have been a little bit of benefit there as well. Either way, by 56, the M5A1 was in service. This one here is actually a Milper. Pretty late production, all things considered. We'll get there. But in the beginning, what they did is essentially switch over contracts of existing makers. Ariel had already finished their M5 contract, and so in 57, they were given a contract to make the new M5A1. J&D, who was just in the middle of their second M5 contract, actually transitioned over right then and there to make the M5A1. What's interesting about these two early contracts, they're not marked M5A1. They're marked M5-1. Now, some have speculated they saw the M5E1 mark and they just took the E out and put the 1 in. I don't know about that, because they could have easily replaced the E with an A. I think they just didn't know yet. It was just chaotic. I don't know. It's just worth pointing out that the M5-1 and M5A1 are the same mechanically. Just early markings from Ariel and J&D. Also at this time, Comolus is still providing blades as a subcontractor. Returning to the M14's M6, just like with the rifle, both were officially adopted in 1957. However, just like the rifle, actual full production would be delayed for reasons. In fact, the first full M6 contract would not be awarded until 1960, and it would go to Ariel. And the second contract awarded would also go to Ariel in 1961. And then that would be it. Those would be Ariel's final U.S. government contracts. They made other bladed things. Usually it had having to do with like barber stuff, scissors, that kind of thing. But they had enough. I should also say that the blades that Ariel used are still from Comolus at this point. And I don't know exactly the contract number, 280, 300,000 of the two put together. But we will come to a new maker. Milper. In February of 1961, they would be awarded a contract for over 400,000 M6 bayonets. And I think one of the reasons they were so optimistic was because Milper had a new way of making the blade. Remember, the M5 had been made from stampings, and the M6 kept that on. But Milper had a new cold stamping technique that was supposed to make things faster and easier because it required far less grinding of the blade into its final shape. In fact, really only the edge would still have to be ground. So that all sounded good, you know, cheaper, faster. It didn't work out so hot. Not even a year later, they're severely behind schedule. And quality control isn't what it should be. Management kind of sucks. So in 62, we also give a contract to Imperial to make M6 bayonets, although Milper would keep on struggling for a while. In 1967, Imperial would be given the next and final U.S. government contract to make the M6 for about 265,000, 270,000 pieces. M6 production would result in about 1,600,000 examples. And you'll have some also made over in Taiwan and a few other places. But keep in mind, the M14 was not adopted by many nations. And there would be a few 21st century contracts because of reasons, wars and all that. But this is really important for this video because of how it influenced the M5. Ariel and J&D would actually not be picked back up to make M5A1s. Next, we'll see Milper. In early 1962, they were given a contract to make 190,000 of these, to which many protested, pointing out, rather correctly, they were struggling to make the M6. Why give them more work? To which the powers that be said, shut up, it's going ahead. Yeah, would it shock you to learn that they're not keeping up with things? Despite that, they get a second M5A1 contract in 1965, although this one would be earmarked for foreign sales, foreign distributorship, not U.S. use. And then they would actually get a third contract to make the M5A1 in 1966. The wheels are coming off at the factory. They are way behind. You actually see quite a few changes in 67, 68 as they struggle to meet demands. In fact, they abandoned their cold stamping technology, just going back to standard grinding a blade. And you see a rounded edge to the spine appear on this type, be it the M5 or the M6. Sorry, late production M5s and M6s also feature this curve. Now this is an Imperial. See this little curvy dealio? That's the run out. This curved style actually appeared initially on the in-house made blades that J&D did. Now a lot of times they would use Camillus blades as well, but when they made their own, it's just easier to machine that way. And it was kind of allowed as a, it's not spec, but it'll meet things. And so I think at this point they just want to get whatever they can get out of Milper, and they let them get away with it. Now, in 1974, they actually officially allow this slant, slope, or curve to the run out. And that's why on this Imperial here, we have it. Now, Imperial would get a contract to make M5A1s in 1967. And because they were a competent maker, they would fulfill it. They would get another one around 1972, 73. And they would fulfill it. This one's kind of neat because this contract was 1976. And it featured the rounded spine and the curved run out. I think it really feels neat. And this would be important because this was the final M5A1 U.S. government contract by anyone. By this point, would it shock you to know that Milper is completely just, they're gone, they're out of business, whatever. Imperial would actually remain for another decade, finally kind of collapsing after the 1980s, the M9 bayonet trials and all that. Ariel, who had backed out, they had actually stayed a solvent, relevant, reasonably profitable company for another half century, so kudos. Like I said, we had about 1.6 million M6 bayonets. Well, the M5, M5-1, M5A1, all of these put together, roughly 1.5 million. And we're not talking foreign clones, copies, commercial, otherwise, and of course reproductions today, not getting into that. Just, you know, and a lot of these were for foreign sales, foreign exports, just as the late M4s. And, you know, they're all using very similar grip scales, very similar, almost identical blades. They all use the M8A1 scabbard. Just adapted for 3 different firearms. And there would actually be a fourth, but this video's gone on long enough. I'll talk about it in the next and final installment. But I really do love how it all just started off with the M3 here. Even now, the blade styling, it's all there. Most of the changes are back at the grip, but the blade itself must have worked pretty good, kind of like the M8 scabbard. And we'll also talk about the final kind of production contracts for that scabbard as well. Anyway, appreciate you kind of nerding out with me, talking about blades. Let me know what you think. Collecting can be a lot of fun when it comes to these. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please do check out the Patreon page. With that, this is Misha. Catch you very soon.